Welcome to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, a podcast about geek culture by lawyers, with your hosts, Ben Siders and Kirk Damon. Today's episode is brought to you by Mortimer Mouse Political Consultants and Advisors, campaign and lobbying strategists since 1989. We work Sundays. In fact, we only work Sundays.
And welcome back to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy with your host, Ben Siders, that's me, and the other guy is Kirk Damon.
That's Kirk, as in the captain of the real Enterprise.
It's here, guys. The episode everybody has been asking for.
Yep.
Character copyright and fan fiction.
We've heard plenty of it, as people saying, why can't we get into this more? We've obviously touched on it a few times in conjunction with it. But this is the episode focused on it, probably the episodes focused on it, because this is a major issue.
This may play out over a couple of episodes. This topic, for whatever reason, really captures people's imagination. When I first screened the idea for this podcast, on ISCA, by the way, of all places, if you listen to our last episode, the number one feedback I got from people was character copyright. That's the episode I want to hear. Why do you think this topic catches people's attention so much?
I think it catches it for a couple of reasons. One, because I think a lot of people want to play in these universes. They see the stuff out there. They want to know what they can and can't do. But I think character copyright in particular catches people's attention because we look at characters and say, how is a character a copyright? I mean, I think everybody accepts copyright, like copyright in a movie, copyright in a book, copyright in a song. But the idea of copyright, when we say no, it's not that, the copyright is in Hamlet, the copyright is Hamlet. And we kind of get into this thing like, wait a minute, how does this person attach a copyright when what we're really talking about is the work of creative fiction? Again, I think we're used to it being a particular work, a particular, sort of thing with it, but this is not a work. This is kind of an artificial construct.
Yeah, and it seems sort of non-intuitive, right? Like, you watch a movie, is every character in the film now copyrighted? But so much of what you see is just random extras. Like Braveheart's got a big battle scene with a bunch of random Scottish soldiers. Well, obviously there's no copyright in, a Scottish soldier. And
I think the other thing you get into a lot of it, and quite frankly, just to follow up from Charlotte from our last episode, you get into a lot of cosplay. People want to be these characters. I remember one of the big comments, and it's something I remember responding back, is a bunch of people coming in and, complaining about Rey when sort of that initially came out, and, why did they make Rey a woman? And our response back to it is after seeing, episode 7, I want to be Rey. it's the kind of thing where it's, you want to be these characters. You really want to sort of, want to be able to dress up as them. You want to play yourself out as them. And I think it's something we've done we did as kids. I mean, my kids are constantly playing as, being characters from movies and stuff like that.
They fight over who gets to be who.
Yeah. And we're used to dressing up at Halloween, and we kind of look at this idea and say, wait a minute, how can these guys be copyrighted? How can these guys be protected? Isn't this something that it almost sort of enters the public consciousness?
Well, there's two dimensions of this that people seem to be really interested in, and one of them we're going to hit on today, one of them we're not. The first dimension is this widely distributed internet, I'm going to call it a legend, although there's an element of truth to it.
Yes, there's an element of truth to it, unfortunately.
That the copyright term in the United States keeps getting extended to prevent Mickey Mouse from entering the public domain. And there's a chart that I've seen thrown around that shows when the copyright's going to expire compared to when Congress extends it. And there certainly does seem to be some kind of relationship there. Now, you could argue it's coincidental. We've got some treaties that require us to extend copyrights, but we're not going to get into that part today because we first need to lay a little bit of the groundwork for what character copyright is in the first place. So our conversation is going to focus more on the fan fiction aspects of it and going beyond character copyright, not just what protects characters, but settings and universes and things like that. And what would prevent you from creating your own original works that happen to be set in somebody else's universe?
Yeah, and I think the thing we're really going to get into this is the concept of, and I think this is the piece that we're going to focus on in this, the individual characters, the individual pieces. So when we talk about, we've talked about copyright previously, we've talked about the idea that yes, the Star Wars movie is copyrighted. There's sort of no question in conjunction with that. But now we're getting at what individual pieces of Star Wars are potentially subject to copyright. And that's where this gets really interesting. It's almost sort of like saying it's sampling in music for movies, and in sampling for music, hey, a 3-second clip can be considered a copyright infringement.
Unless it's Taylor Swift, apparently.
For those of you who didn't see that a few weeks ago, yeah. But anyway, that's the sort of thing. We're going to try to get into essentially what are the pieces here. And to understand that, I think we need to introduce a little bit of introduction in copyright. I know you guys have done this before if you've listened to us, but in case there are any new listeners, we better do just a brief intro here.
Yeah, so quick 60 seconds in copyright. Those of you who listen know it's a right granted to authors. You get it automatically by operational law. And when you make something creative, you get exclusive rights in creative and expressive works only. And whoever has those rights is the only person that can make copies of the work that can distribute the work publicly, that can display or perform the work publicly, or can create derivative works from whatever it is that you've made. And an important concept that kind of plays on First Amendment considerations is this thing we call the idea-expression dichotomy or divide. You can Wikipedia that and get a lot of detail on it, but it basically says that there's a balance between free speech and copyright where we don't want copyright to prevent people from effectively communicating ideas or concepts or making their own original creative expression. So you can copyright an expression of an idea, a particular expression, but you cannot copyright the underlying idea itself, at least in theory.
At least in theory. And I think the thing to point out this in character copyright and where this sort of comes in with the idea-expression dichotomy is the concept of there are essentially archetypes of characters. So when we talk about the idea of what is a character, are we talking about a character which is an archetype, or are we talking about a character which is the specific expression of an archetype? So I think that's the thing we get into is an archetype is the idea. The particular character is an expression of the archetype.
So like the wide-eyed scientist is an archetype. Dr. Emmett Brown from Back to the Future is a particular character.
I mean, and you can definitely come up with these very, very easily. I mean, the mad scientist, uses sort of the same sort of scientist thing in conjunction with it, which we can immediately think of hundreds of different mad scientists, very different people. I mean, you have Dr. Octopus versus Dr. Frankenstein. You can definitely get at those kind of idea expression dichotomies. The hard part I think you get into is it's oftentimes what is the archetype? And what is an archetype versus what is the character?
Well, there's a fundamental question about how far these copyright rights extend. And let's take a very simple example. Kirk, I think you've read the Game of Thrones books?
I've read them, yes. I have not watched all of it. No, I did get it for – my wife actually got it for me for a present. I think I have all the seasons now that have been released on DVD.
Those of you who've read the books, you've been patiently waiting for 7 or 8 years now for the next book?
I still haven't read the last one. I haven't read Dance of Dragons yet, so I'm still one away. But
so what would stop somebody? Kirk, you and I are both self-styled writers of some sort. What would stop one of us from just writing a continuation of that story with those characters? It would be a whole new expression.
Yep.
We wouldn't be copying anything that Martin wrote. We wouldn't be distributing copies publicly of anything he wrote. We wouldn't be displaying or performing his works. It'd be a wholly original work. So why couldn't we do that?
Yeah, and I think that's. And now we're getting at exactly why sort of character copyright exists in some respects. So what we're talking about in many respects is that you're writing a sequel.
Yeah.
We're talking about the idea of that somebody's writing a sequel to the book. Or a prequel or anything else. I mean, when we say sequel, we don't necessarily mean that it's a
continuation.
Yeah, it's a continuation that's temporally after the original. It could be, a continuation that comes temporally before it. But what we're really getting into in these things is character copyright. And the concept behind character copyright is that in order to write the sequel, in order to write, whatever the next book in the Game of Thrones book series is going to be, one would have to utilize characters which are essentially the creation of George R.R. Martin and are entitled to copyright on their own.
So Daenerys, Jon Snow, all the main characters you'd need to talk about them to continue the story.
Exactly. And I think that's, when you look at it from that point of view, it sort of makes some sense as to why you have character copyright. And the reason we have it, just to keep in mind, is people oftentimes talk about the idea that there's a copyright protecting sequels. And the answer is there isn't necessarily anything that would necessarily be called a sequel right.
It's not that clear.
Yeah, and
you have the derivative work right, but it's not a complete match.
Yeah. And derivative work, when you really look at what sort of derivative work was under copyright, derivative work really wasn't sequels because derivative work kind of had to derive from the first one. Yeah, we still look at it and say this derives from it, but not in the same way like a translation does, which is really the same work, but obviously you're going to have some potential, changes with it. And you also sort of get into, well, where does and we've talked about this previously, where does derivative work lie and where is it become transformative fair use? And you kind of see, again, this kind of bump is like, wait, derivative work may not necessarily work for this area. And that's where I think character copyright has come into play, is to try to deal with this problem.
Yeah, and the derivative work rules, there's a definition of derivative works, and it has to be one based upon, a pre-existing work, obviously. But then the Copyright Act gives some examples of what they're talking about. So like a translation, a dramatization, fictionalization, making a movie version. These are all derivative works which would be separately and independently copyrightable, but based on the original work. The thing is, you can conceptualize conceptualize a way that you could write fan fiction that would not qualify as a derivative work. You could just not reference the characters, or just an example, take Star Trek. You could make a whole new book or movie or whatever, set it on a planet that's never been named, never mention Kirk or Spock, never mention the Starship Enterprise. You could really write around the IP that's in Star Trek, but still make it really clear you're set in Star Trek. You mentioned phasers, or you mentioned the Federation. I mean, Federation is a pretty generic word.
Yeah, and that's the thing with it. I think the thing to really keep in mind about sort of derivative work when we did it, and you talk about all these examples of it, one of the key words in it is that they basically say it's the equivalent of the original work being recast or adapted. That's kind of the way they say it, or transformed. And this is not the original work. It's clearly not the original work. You're moving beyond it. You're moving to that idea of a sequel. And so how, what do we look at and do we say basically what is the thing for a sequel? Now, part of this I think we need to talk about just briefly is one, just acceptance of it. And I think one of the things that we're used to as geeks, and as a lot of people in sort of science fiction realms, we're used to the idea of canon versus non-canon.
Yes.
And let's face it, if we were to write a sequel to Game of Thrones, or, to write the seventh book in conjunction with it, would not be canon. Nobody would accept it as canon. It would be understood to not have anything to do with it.
The true believers barely accept the films, for that matter.
Well, let's face it, is the canon the TV show or the books? And actually right there, we've got a first question, because now we seem to have a clear derivative work. We can look at it and say the TV show, which is going off in a totally different direction, presumably, to what the books are going to go, is probably a derivative work, because it's clearly based upon the originals. It's essentially continuing the storyline, which began with essentially a translation or a movie version of it, and is now going off on its own. But which one's actually canon, and are they both entitled to separate copyright? And the answer is they are.
Not to mention the characters. The characters could evolve in very different directions. So do you have two different character copyrights in the same characters?
Well, and that's actually one of the things you can bump into that's really kind of intriguing with characters. And actually there's a case out there on Sherlock Holmes. And the issue with it is Sherlock Holmes was actually, there's basically, my understanding is there's a group of books that were written for Sherlock Holmes, and there was a window in which none were written, and then they wrote a sort of second group afterwards. And the Sherlock Holmes character evolves. He learns various things. The reason it matters is because the time period we're in right now, the copyrights on the first group has expired, but the second group has not. And the case that basically had to do with this is that basically you could use Sherlock Holmes, but you couldn't use aspects of his character that developed in the later books. Apparently the major one is that he was afraid of dogs, because the Hound of the Baskervilles occurred somewhere in here. And, you look at that and you sort of say, we've got this evolving character now that's changing. So you could essentially have two characters, two separate copyrights. You could literally have two separate copyrights in two different versions of the same character.
Now, Kirk, you looked into the origins of this character copyright at some point, not too long ago, and it seems clear to both of us that the derivative work right by itself probably isn't enough to provide the scope of protection that copyright owners would want. But that said, the law seems to have just sort of recognized this for a long time, going back to the last major amendment, 1976 was the last big Copyright Act amendment. Before that was 1909, and in between there's plenty of cases that just recognize, there's some copyrightability in characters, but the rationale for why it exists is not abundantly clear.
Yeah, and a lot of what the courts will tell you, and I think if you're going to sort of investigate the background of a lot of this law, what they try to tell you is effectively the characters are something entitled to their own copyright. That by the act of creating them, they've become sufficiently the creation of the author that they're entitled to copyright outside of the book. And it's kind of the way we can look at it and say, like, hey, if I hear a piece of music, but then I generate a piece of art from listening to the piece of music, I've obviously generated something separately copyrightable, even though it's influenced by it. The idea sort of behind this is that I think that when you're doing this act of creation, you create things that essentially have a life of their own. You'll hear from like a lot of authors where they say, when they write the book, they write the character and then they just let the character take place in the story and move
people
forward.
Say, how do you write? You come up with your stories. They say, I don't come up with them. I find them.
Yeah, and it's this character does this, and then how would this character react? And I know a lot of times authors have like problem points with their fans because like they feel the need to have a character be killed because it fits with the way that character would behave. Yet it's a very like enduring character people really love. What you really see, and this is sort of my take with it, and it's going to sound a little bit cynical in conjunction with this, is you see a lot of follow the money, unfortunately, coming through out of character character copyright. And you see the idea that basically says, well, there's no copyright because effectively characters are archetypes. Then you kind of see that, well, there is a character copyright because they're sufficiently defined. And interestingly enough, one of the places it oftentimes starts is it started, I think, a lot of visually portrayed characters. When we were talking about pure novels, I think there was not as much used of the idea of character copyright.
Well, there's a case on that, right, in the 50s that you found, the Warner Brothers versus Columbia, where they held that literary characters were not sufficiently fleshed out to warrant copyright protection.
Yeah,
as a
and
character.
basically that was the I'm trying to remember the famous detective. It's escaping me right now.
That's Sam Spade.
Sam Spade.
Yeah.
And basically they determined that Sam Spade, as a literary work, was not sufficiently laid out to become a character copyrightable, and therefore could be presented as a movie character because that made him more definite.
But then Disney sues people in the 70s, and the rules change.
And the rules change. And the thing I think you get into is I do think you start seeing more visual medium. And that seems to be one of the things. And one of the things I get into, and just so you guys know, I published a rather large scholarly paper about this a long time ago. But one of the things that I got into in conjunction with it is you seem to have this feel that, like, you need the character to be really well laid out in multiple ways. So the example with it is you can't just have the way they talk. You have to have them be described in great detail. Well, obviously, describing them in literary works, like saying what they look like, is not nearly as powerful as showing them on a screen, particularly if it's something where it's wholly created. So it's an animated character where there's no actor or anything, underplaying it. And that seems to be, you got a lot of comic book characters starting to come in and say comic book characters are different because they're portrayed visually.
That's the Disney case. They said that since there's a visual depiction of the character and there's art involved, so now there is some sort of expression inherent in the character itself.
Yeah, and that's what's weird. Is it didn't say their appearance, it didn't say the artwork associated with them, it said the character. And you saw this carrying through. There's been a number of characters that have sort of been associated with comic books that have been found to be character copyrighted. What you then have is, I think, the court finally recognizing that, look, we can't make this dichotomy. We can't say that if you draw the character, somehow you get more protection than if you describe the character in writing. And basically saying it has to be sufficiently portrayed. So basically it has to be distinctive.
And that seemed to be well established by at least the late 80s. We got the Olsen versus NBC case where they basically said, you know what, that Warner Brothers thing in the 50s was kind of a one-off. They're wrong. That's not how we're going to do this
it was effectively
anymore.
a mistake. They couldn't really overrule it, but it was effectively a mistake. And I think they basically said sort of, hey, there's distinctive characters. But at the same time, you do have the requirement to be a sufficiently distinctive character.
We should point out most of this law is not from the Supreme Court. It's from the Ninth Circuit, which has, shockingly, California in it.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of this is coming from, just because, what you're talking about.
That's where the lawsuits come from,
is
the movie industry.
It's movies.
But what does sufficiently distinct mean? So let's give some examples of who's a sufficiently distinct character.
Yep. So, I think the one that gets thrown out a lot as sufficiently distinct character, and the one that I always like to pick on, is Superman.
Yeah.
Superman is a very distinct character. He's very specific. Everybody knows essentially exactly what he looks like, how he behaves, what he does. You can make fun of him for that reason because he is so specific as to what it is.
We're talking on the way over, though, like, is Superman distinct because he's famous or because the character is actually that distinct? Like, what is his personality, really?
And
other than boringly good.
Yeah, and he is unfortunately sort of the boringly good Boy Scout, and that's I think where you can make fun of him a little bit. But the thing that I think you get into with Superman is Superman has evolved. And how do you deal with the evolution of character? And particularly when you're talking about the idea of an author, I'm going to kind of get into that canon bit again. Why does the author get to say this is what they are 20 years after they created them? Why do they get to add this aspect to their personality? And we kind of look at it and say, well, because that's the author's right. They created the character. But why does that then change? And going back to the Sherlock Holmes case, why does that potentially extend their character copyright on the grounds that this is a new character? Isn't this always been an aspect of the character? So the example would be, as we take Sherlock Holmes being afraid of dogs, we could say, did Sherlock Holmes acquire that, which may be a change to the character, or did he always have that? And we all talk about retconning history, in conjunction with games and stuff like that. What you have here, in some sense, is you can have a retconning, where you have basically somebody coming in and saying, hey, look, I'm going to add this new aspect to this character's personality, yet it's always been there. You just didn't realize it. What does that mean? Isn't this a new character? Isn't this a change of the character? And how do we say that the character is copyrightable if we didn't know that this was part of their personality?
Well, let's look at another couple examples. James Bond.
Yep. It was obviously changed dramatically and, over the years. Multiple different actors. Even the most recent movie, I think Inspector, they basically indicated James Bond was more of a persona than an individual person.
Oh, this one, I like this one. Godzilla.
Yeah.
What is Godzilla's character?
Godzilla's a giant river monster.
A giant river monster.
But I mean, everybody does know specifically Godzilla. I think specifically Godzilla has a look that is different. He's not a T-Rex. I mean, is that kind of thing.
He's got the big plates and breathes fire sometimes, I think.
Yeah, he breathes fire, at least in certain aspects of his thing. But I think the thing you go into with Godzilla is most people would be able to point to Godzilla versus not Godzilla.
Yeah.
Even though effectively Godzilla is nothing other than a giant lizard.
And how about some stock characters that have been held by courts to not be copyrightable?
Yep.
I've got a couple examples written down here. Hard-nosed police captain.
Yep.
That's a
yeah, that's pretty standard as to what you encounter in virtually any
I
case.
want your badge. I love this one. Gesticulating Frenchman.
Yes, the gesticulating Frenchman was found to be a insufficiently distinct stock character.
Fire-breathing dragon. That's pretty straightforward. Yep. This is my favorite, though. I didn't know this was an archetype. Drunken suburban housewife.
Yeah, but these are house, and a part of this you got to keep in mind. These came out of specific things.
Yeah, these are all from cases.
They're all specific cases as to sort of what they had. There's just the Frenchman. I'm trying to remember. What I think was found to be in one of Shakespeare's works as an original.
Either that or Monty Python, right?
Well, I think it came into Monty Python. This is where it may have been, but it's found to have been a stock character from way back from like Shakespeare time.
Well, here's what I find bizarre about this. So if the character is sufficiently distinct, then there's some copyright to it, and that means other people can't make new material that use that same character. So we kind of talked about this a couple episodes ago. If you want to reuse somebody else's IP, like Warcraft did with Warhammer, you just re-express the same idea in different expression.
You're using the same archetypes with different expressions. So again, we're getting to that idea expression dichotomy.
Exactly. So instead of Superman, we're going to have Amazing Man, who comes from another planet.
Well, and the case actually involved Greatest American Hero, which for those of you who definitely are the millennial class have no idea who he is.
Yep.
Essentially, that was a parody comedy TV show where Greatest American Hero was essentially a parody of Superman.
So, Kirk, have the courts let people get away with this, just remaking Superman and changing his name?
Yes and no, I think is the answer. I think a lot of it depends on what it is. And I think what you really see and where you really see the courts going in conjunction with this, and a lot of the discussion of is it Superman or is it another character that happens to use the same archetype?
Is it different enough?
Yeah, is it different enough? But even, and where I say it is it's almost like they impart Superman a personality and say Superman is a person. As a person, are you referring to the same Superman or not? So again, if you look at like the Greatest American Hero case, they say Greatest American Hero is not Superman. He's a parody of Superman. He's designed to be funny. It's not Superman. Yet they look at something and say, hey, you've got this person who wears, red and blue, and the example I use is like Supergirl. So you can kind of look at Supergirl and say, but Supergirl is clearly a derivative, clearly related to Superman. Even though that's nothing to do with character copyright because of the fact they're both produced by the same comic book studios and they're obviously designed to be related. But it's one of those where you kind of look at it and say it's designed to be the same person. It's designed to reference that particular Superman in a way that's sort of unavoidable. And we touched with this in the episode a couple times ago too, with Nazi and the issue of trademark on Nazi. Is that term references a particular sort of general archetype. Yet at the same time, I mean, there's huge numbers of different things you can do inside that general archetype without having to make a particular identical one to the sort of class stereotypical brown
clearly
shirt.
a stock character, and in a World War II setting, it's going to be Sans Affair. It's going to be obligatory background material you have to have to tell the story.
You essentially have to have it and you have to use it. And I think that's the things you get into. What's interesting is when you see the courts, the courts seem to have trouble with the idea of where does the line cross between a sufficiently distinct character and a named character.
Well, they also seem to struggle with at what point are you actually infringing the copyright, and what they look at is the expression the same, but is the basic concept, is the idea the same, is the look and feel the same. First of all, this violates the idea-expression dichotomy, and second, it sounds like trademark.
Yeah, it does start to sound like trademark. And that's what we really bump into with this is we start to see the court seeming to imply like likelihood of confusion test, which is a trademark principle to copyright and to something where there's no goods sold. We look at this and say, have there been goods and services sold by the George R.R. Martin books? No, there's no, brand name for anything associated with characters. Well, there is in some cases, I think. But, for the most part, the characters, they exist solely in a fictional universe. They aren't brands. Yet we kind of start applying these things. Is it confusingly similar? And again, that's the idea where they seem to get at. And what I think is interesting about it is you seem to get a lot of these sort of questions with it of, is it is it a named character or is it a non-named character? And you can almost have the same description for a named character as you have for a non-named description character, and they find one to be subject character copyright and the other one not to be.
It's almost, I mean, to your earlier point about follow the money, it kind of is a character. It's not so much about the distinctiveness of the character. It seems to be more about the fame of the character. Like, is the character well enough known that people would recognize them and know whose character it is, which again just sounds like trademark.
Yeah. Well, one of those I actually popped into it, and it said, one of the things that I proposed in my paper is I said, this might actually be better if we're handled by a right of publicity type analysis, using the idea of a fictional character or literary character being a personality entitled to a right of publicity. So basically, are you referring to that person? So, for example, it's, if I was to refer to, any sort of, actor or actress by name, I'm presumably referring to that person, yet there's maybe other people who have the identical name that I could refer to and not be referring to that person. That's where kind of you bump into the right of publicity as to, what it would potentially be.
Michael Jordan. You got Michael Jordan, the athlete, and Michael B. Jordan, who was just in Black Panther.
Yeah. And so those kind of things where you've got it's, which one am I referring to? It's, you've got each has got a right of publicity, unquestionably, but I can't, I'm not going to get in trouble for referring to one by not referring to the other by essentially the right of publicity of the other. And the one case I like to pick on in conjunction with this is this, and you have it in here, is that in our notes for today, is this A-Team versus Cargo case. And for any of you guys who watched the A-Team, yes, we're reminiscing about the 80s again. Actually, really like the late 70s.
Really, the late 70s, the A-Team.
The A-Team.
This is Mr. T, for those of you.
It made Mr. T's career, and I mean, Mr. T is probably the star stealer of the show of the A-Team. I mean, his character is great. But basically, the A-Team is a group of essentially Vietnam veterans that go out and help people, that need help. The issue with it is that they were sued, actually, when they created the A-Team by a scriptwriter who had proposed a basic idea of a show called Cargo. And the Cargo show involved a group of Vietnam veterans who all have very similar personalities to the A-Team. I mean, literally each character is identical. And one of the important aspects and just one of the key things in the A-Team is that Mr. T's character is deathly afraid of flying. He's not afraid of anything except for flying. And so having to get him on a plane is always one of the sort of fundamental issues of a lot of the episodes. That's one of the aspects that's discussed in Cargo. And it's one of these things where you get into it and you look at it and you say, wait a minute, that sounds like this not be the same characters. And that was found to not be a copyright infringement because the Cargo characters were archetypes.
That seems crazy.
And you kind of look at it and go, but wait a minute, doesn't that make the A-Team characters copyright just by putting a name to them? By calling them, that this is this character, that this is, I can't remember the characters' names at this point in time. I want to say there's a Hannibal for some reason.
Hannibal Smith, was it?
Yeah, Hannibal Smith, I think was the leader of them.
I didn't watch the A-Team, so I don't know.
But, does by calling him Hannibal Smith, does that somehow make him a character beyond an archetype? Because obviously they developed, we only saw them during these, brief hour-long windows of time, or really 40 minutes plus ads, of, what their character was. How much of their character do we really get? Weren't they really an archetype?
Yeah, and so if in the Cargo script the characters were described but not named, and the only thing you've done is put a name on them, and that's enough, because the danger of that is if the Cargo characters weren't copyrightable, then arguably the A-Team characters wouldn't have been either, right? So then what's to stop? I don't know what channel that was on. What's to stop another network from
NBC?
Was it?
Not
what's
sure
to stop another network from making their own copycat? Show. And you do see this play out, I think, in Hollywood a little bit. How often do you see two movies about the same basic subject matter get made at about the same time?
Yep.
So you get Deep Impact and Armageddon.
Yeah.
And then you've got Inferno and Dante's Peak. These things tend to get made in pairs. My theory on that is that a screenwriter pitches a script, a studio passes, Studio B picks it up, and Studio A says, oh crap, we need to make one too, because they're doing it.
Some of it's also just, I think, because it's what's popular and sort of you want to talk about in sort of modern culture. So obviously we were interested in the end of the world, so we were making Armageddon, we're making all these other movies about the end of the world.
This whole concept applies particularly to Mickey Mouse. We're not going to go into a lot on the specifics of Disney in this episode, but your point about Sherlock Holmes comes up here because Mickey Mouse has had very different appearances over time, very different personalities over time. Yep. He's evolved so much that the evolution of Mickey Mouse specifically has been studied academically.
Yep.
And obviously this is a big deal because to the extent that there's a copyright on Steamboat Willie, it expires in a couple years.
Yeah, it's getting very close. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind in Mickey Mouse is, we talk about the idea of appearance changing over time. Steamboat Willie's black and white. Mm-hmm. He doesn't even have any colors at that point in time. I mean, and he's basically line. It's not like it's, really shaded to be specific colors or anything along those lines. I mean, we are talking about something where, that aspect of his personality, what color his shorts were, is not something that exists in Steamboat Willie. I don't even think he particularly wears those, the sort of the stereotypical shorts that we're used to him wearing.
Or the trademark ears. Like the ears is a thing everybody thinks about.
Yeah, everybody thinks of the ears. I mean, he does have the ears because obviously he's still a mouse. But but I think you get into, that type of thing that we look at and say, hey, this evolution, we look at it and say, well, when does Mickey Mouse's copyright run? One of the key aspects of copyright is copyright law has to provide protection for a limited amount of time. That's required by the Constitution, that it has to be for a limited amount of time. And so we look at it and we say, well, what is the limited amount of time for Mickey Mouse? Actually, interestingly enough, another character that sort of bumps into this is Red and Yellow, the M&Ms. Mm-hmm. Red and Yellow have actually been the characters representing M&Ms for a large number of years, and their appearances have also changed. And obviously new ones have been added to sort of the universe. We've had green get added, now we've had caramel, those kind of things get added. Now, there's an argument that they're trademarks, so they're going to be subject to trademark law because they're clearly selling brands and stuff like that. But you see a lot of this evolution of characters over time, and when you talk about it as the idea of character copyright, because even for trademark, there's still a copyright in the underlying artwork and in the character. How exactly does this run? And I think that's one of the reasons that, quite frankly, character copyright is a popular issue amongst fans, is because it's hard to
reconcile it. Like, at what point is the character established?
Yeah, at what point is the character established, and at what point does the character effectively expire and it becomes public domain?
Because if I'm Disney, and this is not just me playing devil's advocate, this is what makes sense to me. They seem completely paranoid about Steamboat Willie's copyright expiring, and that Mickey Mouse is then going to enter the public domain. But if it was me, I'd be thinking, well, but I mean, all that really expired is that particular motion picture, and that's it. And whatever they did with Mickey in the 1950s and 1980s and last year is all still separately copyrightable. And I would argue, to the extent that his personality now has any copyrightability, it certainly arose after Steamboat Willie.
I think the problem you bump into with that, though, is then if you look at it and say it has to have a limited term, when did it start?
So can you just keep modifying the character's personality ad infinitum to where it never expires?
And clearly, I think the reason, to be quite truthful, I think the reason Mickey Mouse is actually one of the things related to this is because Mickey is one of the first animated characters. Mm-hmm. And we get back to that discussion we had just a few minutes ago of a visual medium, the visual medium being more important to defining visual characters. This is one of the first characters we have who's truly defined in a visual medium with a personality, with moving pictures. Animation kind of, was the forefront in many respects of seeing the law be found on character copyright. So it makes sense that Mickey Mouse is one of the earliest. And I think that's part of the issue that we're getting into right now is we haven't really had these characters expire.
Well, that's the thing. And most of the characters that people care about have, I would say in most cases, virtually no literary description or definitions. Almost all done visually or through audio, visual narrative storytelling.
Well, and particularly with sort of modern things, even the ones who do have that are truly literary are converted into movies. Yeah. And I think that's
Lord of the Rings is a good example. I think most people associate those characters with the movies more so than the books.
Yeah, even though you can go back to the original animated Hobbit, which obviously portrayed them and stuff, like that. But I think there is an association, and you want me to do it at science fiction conventions and talking with actors who play science fiction characters that they're not the role they play, but a lot of these people seem to think they are and have personality traits associated with the role they play. We really do associate that visual medium with the idea that this is the character and it has this appearance and this is the person.
Well, setting aside the characters, we'll accept the character copyright as it is, but that doesn't mean I have to use the characters, right? So I can still write my own fan fiction and set my story in somebody else's universe or setting without referencing the characters at all.
Yep.
So now what? Do you argue that the character copyright, that the universe itself is a character?
Well, and that's I mentioned this paper that I published a number of years ago. That's actually the question that I raised in conjunction with that paper. And what I was really focusing on is, what is a character in some respects? So we can look at it and say, is the Starship Enterprise a character? The Starship Enterprise is a thing. Mm-hmm. It doesn't act.
What about the car Kit from Knight Rider?
Yep, the car Kit from Knight Rider, which does have a personality. But I mean, the Enterprise arguably has a personality.
It's got a computer. It talks.
It's an animated image. I mean, it's no different from Mickey Mouse in many respects. We sort of look at it and say, wait a minute. We have this. Yeah, I mean, we have personalities. These things, they do talk. The computer responds. Mm-hmm. It responds in a particular way.
What about the city of Gotham?
Yeah.
Very well defined. Better defined than a lot of characters.
Yeah, other than the fact that it's Manhattan.
Yeah.
But I think you get into, the city of Gotham, the sort of, now we're talking about setting. Is Gotham, what about Arkham Asylum?
Yeah.
I mean, let's get into a really particular, piece of the Batman universe where, I think that Arkham Asylum has been very, very well defined. And you get into these kind of weird questions of sort of saying, well, what about, other aspects of the setting? Well, what about a planet? What about Tatooine?
Yeah.
Which is obviously, it's a desert planet,
Arizona.
It isn't, but has it become something specific in the fact that it's Tatooine as opposed to being Jakku?
Yeah.
Which is also a desert planet, it shares very similar sort of, aspects to it.
We talked about this in our language episode. So there was a Star Trek fan film called Prelude to Axanar. And this is a fan film being made off of, funds raised from a Kickstarter or something like that. And they were eventually sued by Paramount and CBS, arguing that the film violates CBS and Paramount's copyright rights to Star Trek. And I actually pulled the original complaint and looked at it. And it's interesting the arguments that were made. They, the plaintiffs, Paramount, point out that the bridge on the set looks like a Federation starship bridge, that the weapons and technology look like Star Trek weapons and technology, that they have the concept of the Federation as an alliance of planetary governments. They use the words look and feel and mood, that it's basically copying the way that Star Trek seems to be or feels. And again, this all comes across as more of a trademark interest to me.
Or even a trade dress type argument.
Or trade dress. But here's what I found really interesting. They went to the effort in the complaint of saying that the film is not parody or criticism. And there's a good reason for that, because you do have First Amendment rights, broad First Amendment rights for parody and criticism. But isn't that sort of ironic, Kirk? Like you can only make fan fiction if you're making fun of the thing that you're
it is kind of weird. But I mean, admittedly, like even parody is sort of specific formats. As satire is what's actually more the protected thing, more so than
like
parody.
Spaceballs is fine, but Prelude to Axanar is
Spaceballs is arguably not fine. I mean, I think we talk about it.
They probably got permission.
They probably got permission, would be my guess.
I mean, Weird Al does that with everything he samples.
Yes. And that's I think a lot of times you get into these things that quite frankly they're willing to do these types of things with it. But with fan fiction, one, they don't want to have a licensing arm that does this. Now a lot of places do. I mean, if you actually get on a lot of sites, there's a lot of discussion specifically of what fans can and can't do in the universe. They need to claim trademarks, stuff like that.
Yeah, we talked about Paramount now has like fan fiction guidelines because it's just so popular to do that for Star Trek. Well, here's an interesting thing. We kind of talked about this on the way over here too. The Orville versus Star Trek Discovery.
Yep.
Star Trek Discovery is a very different kind of Trek. If you haven't seen it, it's dark, it's gritty, there's profanity, there's some nudity. It is not at all like the Trek you grew up with in the 80s and 90s. It is not like Next Gen.
Yeah.
It is more like a typical 21st century, a gritty, realistic sci-fi product. Then you've got the Orville, which has a very similar look and feel to old school Star Trek. The ships have the sort of smooth lines. Yep. It's a very clean, utopian type future, high production value, similar cinematography. The set design's the same. The plot structure's the same. Even the music is very Trek-like. So we have Orville, which is on Fox, not CBS, that seems to look and feel like Trek. We have actual Trek now, or the movies even, which don't quite feel the same way either as the other ones. They're all space action now as opposed to drama or suspense. So Star Trek itself, the direction Paramount and CBS are taking it, seems to be away from the look and feel and the mood that was established, whereas the Orville is moving into that space. So the question I pose on the way over here is, do they risk undercutting these copyright arguments by altering the way that the property feels?
You've got to wonder. I mean, I think the thing you really look into is, does it undercut it because it basically makes it too broad, so it's not specific, it's not Trek, or does it actually make it stronger because now Trek could be more things?
Yeah, and do you just carve out more intellectual space that people can't get into by just constantly changing what your property is? But then again, we get back to, well, how long does that copyright last?
Yeah. And particularly, I think when you talk about the Orville versus Discovery and the idea of sort of grimdark on one side and sort of this what I always try to refer to as the aluminum foil sort of look on the other side, which was interesting because that's also something when we talk about the idea of an idea expression dichotomy. The idea of science fiction itself has changed changed that way.
It really has.
You go back to like the 1960s, 1970s, science fiction was
guys in
very
labs
hopeful.
and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that's, the best example if you want to go see sort of what I call the aluminum foil and where it comes from, go watch Moonraker, the James Bond, because they all wear essentially aluminum foil outfits. But if you think about it, what we considered space to be at that point in time was heavily influenced by the space program. And so we had this very hopeful, very clean, very sanitized future, which was wonderful. I mean, it was sort of utopian. Then you have Blade Runner. And I mean, I think most people give Ridley Scott the sort of, the kudos for creating grimdark.
Yep.
And the idea
Alien, too,
of, an Alien, but I mean, really, Blade Runner was the first one of just the idea that the future is gross, it's dirty. I mean, you've got to have guys that do, take out noodles, come to your window in Manhattan because you can't actually even get down to the street. That type of idea as to what it is. We then saw science fiction go that way and sort of wholly embrace that. I mean, and that's vast majority of science fiction since then has been that. The lone exception being Star Trek. Mm-hmm. Star Trek has always been very pure, very clean. And again, even the lines of the starships are very lean. The lines of their uniforms very clean, very militaristic, very space program-esque.
And very much contrasting with the other species in the show, which are different culturally, and their technology reflects it. The sort of tribal crudity of the Klingons, everything's very angular and harsh, and has sort of a primitive look to it. And then the Romulans is very, I don't know.
Spy. I think it's sort of spy. Like
the Romans. It's the Roman Empire,
it's very
basically.
subterfuge, though, too. But yeah, I think you get into, but that kind of thing sort of, and you look at it and you say, well, then what's Trek?
Yeah, what is it now?
if Trek is not this idea of the sort of, we are going out in space because we are the great leader, which is basically what Trek sort of implies originally as to what it is. Hey, everything's wonderful. We're great. We figured it out. And our goal is to go out and discover people who haven't yet. And in the same time to explore these questions of sort of our utopia. What is Trek now? If we start saying, well, but it's not that, why is it still Star Trek?
Well, to try and summarize, this is kind of like fair use. It's very fact-specific, but the bottom line is that the more that you clearly use material that belongs to somebody else, the more likely you are to get the hammer, don't you think?
Yeah, I think that there's a few things you get into. And again, what I kind of comment about is I think the biggest thing with character copyright is, are you referring to that character? If the answer is you are using Superman, capital S, Superman as a proper name, you probably are in trouble. Yeah. If you're referring to a generic person who happens to be sort of like Superman and really isn't Superman, but you could say is clearly clearly a separately definable person, you tend to get further away. Now, where that line lies, who knows? And I think it's a very specific, very fact-specific. The other thing that I think comes into it in question with it is, what are you doing with it?
Yeah.
Because if you start talking about, hey, I'm making a multi-million-dollar movie, you might be more likely to get in trouble.
When X&R was worth $1 million, all of a sudden everybody cared. Yeah. And I think that's maybe the takeaway is, if you want to use these things, you've got to be a little more subtle about it. So, the Orville is more Star Trek than Star Trek is now. I'm not aware of any lawsuits being filed. But then Axonar got picked on because they made no bones about it. It's a Star Trek movie. And I think that's what it really boils down to is, if you want to do that, they want their cut of it. Yeah. And I think it's just that simple.
And I think that's the kind of thing. So again, sort of turning to our original thing is, do you want to write the 7th book of The Song of Ice and Fire? The answer is you can't. Yeah. Because that's where you're going to get sued, is because you're writing the 7th book of the Song of Ice and Fire.
Better not say the word Westeros anywhere in there.
Yeah.
If you do and you make it clear that that's what you're connected to, then you're asking for trouble.
Yeah, whereas if you want to write that style of novel, and I mean there's other ones out there, which have written, I think, the style of George R. R. Martin, what's now I'm sort of referring to as the huge epic fantasy, multi-generational in a lot of cases, definitely characters which are disposable. As we've all seen, there are those kind of books out there, and quite frankly, some of them are extremely good. I'd recommend the Dandelion, I think it's called Dandelion Wars, to anybody, which has got a sort of similar feel, but it's actually set in a more like feudal Japan, feudal Korea type of feel thing. And very, very good book that I'd definitely highly recommend. But you have that. You have this idea that basically says it's the same style, but it's clearly a separate universe. Yep. It's an incredibly well laid out universe. It has nothing to do with Westeros.
I think I think the key point I would emphasize is originality, not just in story but in setting.
Yeah, and really what it is you're not referring to the thing. Yep. You are writing something which is totally unique, totally to you. And I think at that point in time you're clearly away.
Well, we've got mail. We have another Well Actually guy. This is from Connor, who says, in your Star Wars Episode 8 Reconciliation episode, Ben said that Kylo Ren kills Ben Kenobi. That never happened. Darth Vader killed Ben Kenobi. Check your facts.
Darth Vader did not kill Ben Kenobi. Nobody has ever killed Ben Kenobi. Yeah. He's still a Force ghost.
And then we also have one from Ed from Iska points out that Lucasfilm is suing a card company that made a Sabacc game, Sabacc, S-A-B-A-C-C. So Sabacc is allegedly in the Star Wars, whether it's the background material, I don't know if it's canon or not, but it's the game that in Empire Strikes Back at some point, Lando Calrissian says,
Han Solo said it.
Yeah. Han won the Millennium Falcon from Lando in some game of chance, and in the secondary materials, they identify the game as being called Sabacc, S-A-B-A-C-C. Well, someone made that game. Presumably didn't license it because they're getting sued over it now. And so Ed wants us to talk about that. This is actually similar. This happens a lot where you get fiction like Duff Beer from The Simpsons. I think somebody actually made that at some point. Yep. We could probably do a whole episode on that.
And this is, it's sort of tying into these types of things where what we're getting into this is, again, these small elements and the idea that these small elements are becoming important. In conjunction with it.
It's universe building.
It's universe building, and where does this go? It's a character copyright question. I mean, you can argue Sabac's a character.
Yeah, it's related, for sure. The last one we got, someone asked about our mailbag episode. We talked about the rules that apply to standard-setting organizations, and Kirk talked about there's a requirement for fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory licensing terms for patents that are considered standard essential patents. So if you have a technological standard and a patent is required to practice the standard, then the patent has to be licensed on fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms. Sometimes that acronym is known as FRAND. Kirk described it on the episode as fair and reasonable terms, which is a whole different acronym. Someone just wanted to clarify that what we meant was FRAND. Yes,
we mean the same thing. However, that is probably the best oops acronym I think ever created.
Whoever that was, I forget who it was, but nice catch. That's I see where your mind's at. Okay. There's the music. It's time to go again. If you have questions, comments, topic ideas, or just want to hear your name on the air, you can send your thoughts to us on Twitter at LGGpod or email us at lggpodcast@gmail.com. You can talk to us on our Facebook page. Search for Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy. You will find us there. You can subscribe to this podcast. You'll find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Podbean, wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you hear, please give us a review. We really appreciate those reviews. It helps other people get our podcasts. And spread the word. Tell your friends. You can find me on Twitter at Benjamin Siders, and Kirk is at KirkDMN. Next time, we are not 100% sure on topic at this point. We might dive more into the particulars of Disney.
I think we're going to go into some more in this character copyright, into this fan fiction thing. I mean, people have demanded this for a while. We're almost 20 episodes in. We probably should actually provide some fan service in the course of doing this.
Yeah, I prepared like a 3-page outline for this. We maybe talked about 10% of it.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing is we're probably going to keep going on the same episode just because there is so much interest on it. So
yeah, this is a big one everybody likes. So that's all for today. We'll see you next time. Lorem, play us out.
The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by Lewis Rice LLC, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer. This podcast was produced and recorded at Cool Fire Studios in St. Louis, Missouri.